The Galactic Council chamber was designed to make individuals feel small, an arena of cold light, metal ribs, and echoing platforms where entire civilizations condensed their voices into a single representative. 4 to 7 species voted that day. 4 to 6 said yes. Only humans said no. The decision had been expected to be unanimous. Every council broadcast declared one species a catastrophic threat. Every data packet told the same story: sabotage, biochemical attacks, entire colonies poisoned. The accused were painted as monsters, frenzied, immoral, beyond rehabilitation. But when humanity's turn came, the human delegate simply said, "Show us the evidence." The council refused. They had already made up their minds. Humanity's refusal sparked a ripple of irritation across the chamber. A dozen ambassadors muttered about the soft-fleshed moralists. Others criticized humans for empathizing with predators. One remarked that humans were strange mammals who bonded with anything that made eye contact, and another sneered that Earth had too much compassion and not enough survival instinct. The human delegate stood alone on the voting platform, hands clasped, jaw tight, knowing the vote was symbolic at best. The extermination proposal passed with overwhelming force. It didn't matter that humanity objected. It didn't matter that they demanded proof. The decision had already been made. The fleet would mobilize within days. Humanity left the chamber with a sense of unease, not righteousness. Even those who distrusted the accused species felt something was wrong. The evidence was too thin. The accusations too dramatic. The council's urgency too rehearsed. But nothing more could be done. The council controlled the fleets, not Earth. The reaction on Earth was divided but intense. Some humans were furious that their objection had been ignored. Others argued that the council must have information humanity wasn't yet cleared to see. Many simply feared the galaxy was shifting into a more dangerous place, one where moral dissent was more inconvenient than valuable. As diplomats returned home, the council broadcast its extermination order across known space. The accused species was given a final ultimatum: surrender to containment procedures, or be erased. Their reply never reached the council. Moments after the ultimatum was issued, every refugee beacon belonging to that species went dark. Their planets, silent. Their stations, offline. The council fleets launched. But something unexpected happened. In a secure monitoring facility on Earth, a young orbital sensor technician saw a flurry of alerts spill across her console, unidentified slipstream signatures, dozens at first, then hundreds, then thousands. She called her supervisor over, expecting an invasion. It wasn't. Every signature belonged to damaged civilian transports, all heading in a single direction. Toward Earth. Emergency channels scrambled. Defense satellites powered on. Every agency argued about whether this was an attack or a plea for help. As the transports drew closer, a fractured transmission broke through the static. The language was heavily distorted, heavily emotional, and heavily afraid. It repeated a single phrase. "Humans, please, sanctuary." The technician played it again and again, unsure whether to be shaken or relieved. The transports weren't armed. Their hulls were torn open, engines failing, heat signatures inconsistent with military craft. Whatever had happened to them had happened recently, and violently. Earth immediately notified the council, but no response came. Not even a confirmation tone. It was as if the council had simply decided Earth wasn't worth answering anymore. Within hours, the first transport limped out of slipstream. It drifted, tumbling, until an Earth rescue tug stabilized its rotation. Others followed, forming a growing cloud of dead or dying ships. Inside them were beings barely holding on to life. Thin, exhausted, terrified, and unmistakably fleeing something far larger than themselves. Global leaders convened in emergency calls. The meeting was a mess of fear and political tension. Some argued the refugees must be turned away before the council accused Earth of interference. Others pointed out that humanity had already interfered the moment they voted no. A few insisted the refugees were too dangerous to accept. Others reminded them that the council still hadn't shown any evidence. But the ships kept arriving. 10, 100, 1,000, each carrying survivors who had chosen Earth over every other world in the galaxy. Humanity wasn't ready for this, not legally, not logistically, not diplomatically. Earth had no universal asylum process, no galactic refugee infrastructure, no precedent for becoming the last sanctuary for a species the Council intended to wipe out. But the refugees kept coming, and the transmissions grew clearer. We come because humans refused. Humans said no. No one has ever said no. Some analysts insisted this was manipulation. A trap. A ploy to drag humanity into a war. But the sensor logs didn't lie, the transports had been fired upon. Chased. Driven into slipstream with engines overheating, radiation shielding failing, hull plating melting. These were not soldiers. These were survivors. Earth had hours, maybe less, to choose a course of action. The human negotiator chosen to receive them was not selected because of rank, but because of reputation. They had a history of talking their way out of disasters, offending high-ranking officials, and refusing to accept because that's how it's done as an answer. Some called them a liability. Others called them exactly the kind of human you want when the galaxy decides to set itself on fire. When they deployed to the landing site, they expected chaos. They expected fear. They did not expect silence, the wide, stunned silence of thousands of refugees kneeling upon stepping onto Earth's soil, as if humanity were some mythic force rather than a species with debt, dysfunctional politics, and coffee addictions. One of the refugees, trembling and skeletal, lifted their head just enough to speak. "We escaped, because you were the only ones who said our lives mattered." The negotiator didn't know how to respond. No one did. The world didn't know what these refugees feared more, death, or the council that had ordered it. And as the refugees begged for sanctuary, a single unsettling question spread across Earth. If this species wasn't the real danger, then why had they risked everything to reach humanity? A second question followed, one no one dared say aloud. What if the Council's extermination order had nothing to do with the refugees at all? And as the final wave of transports drifted toward Earth, burning engines sputtering out, a message crackled through long-range channels, half noise, half warning. They will come for you next. Earth had hosted emergencies before, but nothing in its history resembled the arrival of 10,000 alien refugees in failing ships. Panic bloomed across every news channel before world governments could decide what to say. Commentators speculated wildly. Some feared Earth had already been targeted by the Council for defiance, others insisted the refugees carried some unknown infection, a few claimed humanity had been dragged into a civil war. But beneath the noise was a current of dread, because for all their noise, humans sensed something was terribly wrong. Military bases shifted into high alert. Borders activated emergency air restrictions. Even cities far from the landing zones felt the tension creeping through the air, as if gravity itself had tightened. People gathered around screens, not because they wanted spectacle, but because they wanted reassurance the world would still make sense in the morning. No one received that reassurance. In the center of the confusion was the negotiator, shoved between bureaucrats, diplomats, scientists, and intelligence officers all shouting about protocols that didn't yet exist. The negotiator tried to get answers, but every agency contradicted the next. Earth had no universal refugee intake process for extraterrestrials. No infrastructure prepared for a species the Council labeled dangerous. No agreements to protect people fleeing an extermination order. Earth hadn't even decided whether to treat the refugees as guests, threats, witnesses, or political liabilities. Yet the transports kept arriving, and ignoring them was impossible. The negotiator eventually pushed through the arguments, insisting that someone needed to speak to the refugees, not about them. After hours of paralysis, global leadership agreed. Someone had to make the first move, and the negotiator was already in the field. They were given authority not because the world trusted them, but because no one else wanted responsibility for a decision that might reshape humanity's future. The refugees' first condition was simple: they refused to be separated. They were terrified of division, terrified of being categorized, terrified of being processed like prisoners. They grouped together instinctively, clinging to one another as though contact with humans was the only thing keeping the universe from collapsing. Their fear wasn't logical, it was primal. They behaved like a species that had fled something far worse than public shame. A team of linguists worked frantically, attempting to decode the refugees' language from the fragmented transmissions. But the negotiator didn't wait for perfect translation. They approached carefully, presenting empty hands and an open posture. The alien who stepped forward appeared to be their spokesperson, but the negotiator sensed it wasn't status that made them the leader, it was desperation. The refugees stared at the negotiator as though waiting for a verdict. When the negotiator finally spoke, asking what they needed, the spokesperson responded with halting, broken phrases pieced together from translation scaffolds. "We come because humans said no. We come because no one ever says no." The words confused Earth's analysts. It wasn't unusual for humanity to be stubborn, but the intensity with which the refugees clung to that act suggested something deeper. A vote had given them hope, and hope had driven them across the stars. Their bodies were thin, their skin dulled, their posture unsteady. These weren't warriors. These were people who had starved, fled, and suffered. Medical teams wanted to intervene immediately, but the refugees refused to let their wounded be taken until they understood human intentions. They whispered among themselves, frantic, shaking, as though expecting the negotiator to suddenly reverse their promise. The negotiator responded calmly, explaining humanity didn't harm asylum seekers. The refugees didn't understand the term asylum, but they recognized the tone. Slowly, reluctantly, they allowed medics to approach. As examinations began, scientists reported anomalies. The refugees' bodies showed signs of extended stress exposure, malnutrition, radiation burns from sustained slipstream travel, and forced hyperacceleration. Several had injuries consistent with weapons fire. These findings contradicted the Council's portrayal of them as aggressors. Aggressors do not flee in shredded civilian vessels. Back in global command centers, leaders debated what to do. Some insisted Earth must call the Council immediately and clarify the situation before accusations escalated. Others warned that contacting the Council would expose the refugees' location. A minority argued Earth should refuse entry altogether. But refusing entry meant pushing refugees back into space with failing engines, and humanity had already voted no on extermination. Turning them away would be complicity by another name. The negotiator requested direct communication with global leaders. After reviewing medical scans, hearing the refugees' trembling voices, and observing their behavior, the negotiator concluded they were not infiltrators. They were terrified of the Council, terrified of misinterpretation, terrified humans might betray them. The negotiator pressed a single point. These beings had fled across half the galaxy because humans said their lives mattered. If humanity abandoned them now, everything humanity claimed to stand for would collapse. Even through encrypted channels, the weight of that argument settled heavily. The world had few moments when its identity crystallized. This was one of them. The negotiator returned to the refugees and asked why they had come directly to Earth instead of dispersing to other worlds. The spokesperson hesitated, exchanging glances with their companions. Finally they explained, with a kind of quiet reverence, humans are the only ones who refuse. You refuse the easy path. You refuse the expected. You refuse what others accept. If anyone would help, it would be the ones who said no. Those words unsettled the negotiator more than they comforted. It wasn't normal admiration. It bordered on belief. The refugees didn't see humans as allies, they saw them as some kind of final moral anchor in a universe sliding into brutality. That perspective came with its own pressure. Humanity was known for unpredictability, courage, stubborn morality, but not for carrying the weight of 10,000 lives from a species it barely understood. As the negotiator listened, the refugees asked to be taken to the place where humans decide truth. They couldn't grasp the concept of distributed governments or democratic processes. To them, humanity must have a central authority, a single chamber of decision-making. The idea that ordinary citizens could influence planetary policy bewildered them. The negotiator realized the refugees had no frame of reference for a species that voted against extermination because individuals refused to endorse it. When asked what they feared most, the spokesperson finally answered. Not starvation. Not pursuit. Not exposure to a foreign world. What they feared was the next step in the Council's plan. They trembled as they confessed that the extermination order did not make sense, not the timeline, not the urgency, not the lack of evidence. Something else was hidden behind it. And then the spokesperson said the words that froze every translator working on the line. The extermination vote was not meant for us. It was the first crack in the story the galaxy had been told. And it was the first moment humanity understood that the crisis was not merely a humanitarian one, but a warning of something far more dangerous approaching Earth. The negotiator didn't believe they'd heard correctly at first. Translators replayed the phrase 3 times, then a 4th, then slowed it down. Every version carried the same meaning. The extermination vote wasn't aimed at the refugees. That revelation turned the entire crisis into something far more dangerous. If the accused species wasn't the real target, then who was? The refugees were escorted to a secure underground facility built for high-level diplomatic emergencies, though it had never hosted a moment like this. The negotiator joined Earth's highest-ranking officials in a cramped command room, surrounded by analysts, linguists, strategists, and a growing sense of dread. The room quieted as the refugee spokesperson began to speak, their voice raw but determined, their eyes fixed on humanity as if the truth could only be entrusted to those who had already risked their own safety for strangers. They explained how their species first learned something was wrong. It began with intercepted transmissions between high-ranking council members, private discussions about the human anomaly, about a species whose moral frameworks refused assimilation, whose technological progress outpaced projections, whose defiance in small political matters indicated a potential threat to the Council's long-term control. To the refugees, these intercepted files were chilling, but they had no context to fully understand them. They had only known the Council as a distant authority. They assumed it was simply internal politics. Then the pattern escalated. Council surveillance probes began mapping Earth's infrastructure, far more aggressively than standard observation protocols allowed. Traffic increased around human trade routes. Council ambassadors made frequent visits to species aligned with Earth, subtly pressuring them away from alliances. The refugees didn't understand any of this at the time. Only later, when their own systems were hacked, did the pieces fall into place. One night, without warning, the refugees' planetary network was breached. Files were stolen. Others were fabricated, videos of their ships attacking Council worlds, footage of their people deploying weapons they'd never even built. It was an engineered narrative. A scapegoat. The refugees only discovered these fabrications after the Council presented them as justification for extermination. The negotiator felt something cold settle in their chest. If the evidence against the refugees was falsified, then the extermination vote wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. The Council had needed a test case, someone to erase with minimal political pushback, to prove extermination protocols were still acceptable. Once the galaxy accepted that decision, the next target would be chosen. And according to the intercepted files, that target was humanity. The refugees continued. They had learned the truth only because a whistleblower inside the Council leaked partial data to them, at great personal risk. The whistleblower warned them that the Council's extermination fleet was never intended to stop with a single species. After wiping out the refugees, the Council would declare a secondary vote, one wrapped in seemingly unrelated accusations, aimed squarely at humanity. The negotiator asked why humans had been marked for extermination. The refugees shared everything they had pieced together. The Council feared humans not because humanity was violent, but because humanity was unpredictable. Cooperative in some contexts, rebellious in others, impossibly stubborn in moral matters, shockingly adaptive in crisis, and disturbingly united when faced with collective threats. Humans didn't fit any of the models the Council relied on to maintain galactic stability. Humanity evolved too quickly, changed too rapidly, and refused to obey limits placed on them. To the Council, that made humans dangerous, not now, but eventually. They weren't trying to destroy humanity for what humans had done, but for what they might one day become. The negotiator didn't speak for several seconds. The room was silent except for the hum of machines. Humanity had spent centuries believing the galaxy wanted cooperation, advancement, mutual respect. But behind that facade was an organization terrified of anyone who refused conformity. The refugees' escape then made perfect sense. They weren't fleeing extinction for themselves, they were carrying a warning. Their people had known the Council's extermination plan wouldn't stop with them. They had a choice: die silently or flee to the only species who might defy the Council loudly enough to expose the truth. They chose the latter, even knowing how small their numbers were compared to the force pursuing them. The negotiator asked how the refugees managed to steal the files. The spokesperson explained it had cost them everything. Their intelligence network was small. Their tools were outdated. But their whistleblower had given them the access codes they needed. They discovered the Council's internal strategy documents, timelines, propaganda drafts, fleet deployment schedules, and, buried deep in encrypted layers, contingency plans for Resolution 7. Every reference to Resolution 7 pointed toward humanity. The negotiator demanded proof, and the refugees delivered. They projected the stolen files into the war room, documents stamped with Council insignia, lists of targeted cities on Earth, communications between Council military commanders discussing how to handle human retaliation, even psychological profiles labeling humans as moral outliers with dangerously flexible group cohesion. Analysts ran authenticity checks. The documents passed every test. The truth was undeniable. A murmur moved through Earth's leadership. If humanity revealed these documents publicly, it would ignite political chaos across the galaxy. If they kept the documents secret, the Council could strike before anyone understood what was happening. There was no safe option. One official suggested surrender, capitulating to the Council before things escalated further. Another argued Earth should immediately prepare for war. Others insisted humanity must interrogate the refugees further to ensure the documents weren't fabricated. The negotiator had heard enough. They stood, cutting through the panic, and declared the refugees had no reason to lie. Everything about their ships, injuries, and behavior proved they were running for their lives. Someone pointed out humanity couldn't fight the Council alone. The negotiator countered that humanity didn't need to fight, they needed to expose. The Council's power rested on secrecy. The galaxy didn't know the Extermination initiative was built on lies. If the truth were broadcast, other species might revolt. The Council wouldn't risk a civil war. The conversation halted when an alarm pierced the room. A tactical officer shouted that dozens of Council warships had dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Jupiter. They weren't hiding. They weren't signaling diplomacy. They were forming a blockade position. The negotiator looked at the refugees. The refugees looked at the negotiator. No more words were needed. The Council hadn't come to negotiate. They had come because Earth now had the truth. And the truth made humanity a threat worth erasing. The first contact ship broke atmosphere at sunrise, its hull scorched and trembling as if it had barely survived the journey. Across Earth, people watched the descent in silence, no panic, no cheering, just the collective breath of a species waiting for the verdict of its own choices. 10,000 refugees stood behind that ship's arrival, scattered across temporary shelters, hanging on a single question: would humanity still stand with them now that the truth had detonated through every news outlet on the planet? The negotiator, exhausted, bruised, but steady, stepped onto the landing platform as the vessel's doors opened. From inside emerged the elder who had risked everything to warn humanity. Their translucent skin caught the morning light, their posture reserved but resolute. Both sides understood the stakes. The Galactic Council was already mobilizing, spinning propaganda into every star system, painting humanity and the refugees as co-conspirators destabilizing galactic unity. In 48 hours, a fleet would reach the solar border, massive enough to block out constellations. Earth had never prepared for this. Humans were the species who argued about border control on a planetary scale, not a galactic one. Yet somehow, overnight, ordinary people had become the deciding voice of an entire civilization. Neighborhoods opened their doors. Cities converted stadiums into shelters. Volunteers gathered supplies, not because governments ordered them, but because anger had replaced fear, anger at being manipulated, anger at almost being exterminated without even knowing it. The negotiator moved closer to the elder, lowering their voice. The council expected panic, chaos, collapse. Instead, Earth adapted with the stubbornness of a species historically unwilling to die quietly. Humanity didn't need to be superior, they just needed to be too difficult to eradicate. And that, the negotiator had realized, was humanity's real evolutionary advantage. The elder extended a data crystal, shimmering with encrypted blue light. Inside was the evidence that would expose the council's plan: intercepted votes, falsified intelligence, weapon shipments, and simulations predicting Earth's resistance levels. Enough proof to fracture alliances across the stars. Enough to expose the Council's extermination protocol for what it really was: a preemptive strike against a species they could not control. But releasing it was dangerous. It would destabilize whole sectors, trigger revolutions, possibly civil war among worlds that had never fired a shot in their lives. The negotiator hesitated, weighing Earth's reputation, the refugees' safety, and billions of innocent lives in other star systems who had no idea their governments had nearly voted for genocide. It was the kind of decision no one should ever have to make, yet humanity had been making similar decisions for thousands of years. Survival often demanded moral calculus with no perfect answers. A harsh wind swept the platform as a transmission flared across the sky. The Council fleet had entered the outer system. They delivered a final message: surrender the refugees or Earth would be contained, a euphemistic threat recycled from every empire throughout history. Earth's leaders gathered in underground bunkers, preparing defensive contingencies that everyone knew would crumble against the Council's firepower. Humanity could fight, but the cost would be astronomical. While officials argued, something unexpected unfolded across the planet. Refugees stepped forward, quietly, voluntarily. Thousands gathered outside human capitals, offering themselves to Earth authorities. They didn't want humanity to die for them. They had already lost their homeworld. They refused to be the spark that annihilated another. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves spread online in minutes, igniting a new global response, not fear, but fury. Humans began forming human or refugee chains around evacuation sites, refusing to let military forces separate them. Entire coastal cities projected massive holographic banners into the sky, broadcasting messages toward orbit: if you want them, you take US 2. The Council had prepared for resistance, but not unity, not this kind of unity. Not a species that would stand shoulder to shoulder with strangers who didn't look like them, didn't speak like them, didn't even breathe the same air. The negotiator watched the global movement rise like a tidal wave. Humanity had made its choice. Now it was time to act on it. They activated the data crystal, transmitting the evidence into the quantum relay network. Within minutes, it spread uncontrollably across thousands of star systems. Council delegates who had believed the extermination vote was legitimate panicked as their screens filled with proof of corruption. Worlds began pulling support from the Council fleet. Civilian uprisings erupted on planets where citizens had been told Earth was a threat. The Council's war machine, once unshakable, began fracturing in real time. Back on Earth, the Council fleet detected the transmission and prepared to fire, to silence humanity before the truth could spread further. Their weapons charged, a series of blinding lights gathering at the edges of the sky like artificial suns. Then the refugees stepped forward again, not in surrender, but in defiance. Their scientists activated a shield array built into their battered ship, projecting a shimmering barrier around Earth's atmosphere. It wasn't strong enough to withstand a full bombardment, but it was strong enough to delay the initial strike, the delay humanity needed. Because the evidence had reached the right worlds. Suddenly, dozens of alien ships blinked into the system, not Council warships, but independent planetary fleets refusing to let the Council commit genocide under their flag. They positioned themselves between Earth and the Council Armada, shields raised, weapons powered but aimed upward in warning rather than aggression. It was a standoff no one had predicted. The Council demanded obedience. The galaxy answered with mutiny. Seeing their political collapse accelerating, the Council fleet withdrew, teleporting back toward their core worlds to quell internal rebellion. Earth's sky cleared, leaving only the Allied vessels hovering like guardians above a world that had never asked for them. When the negotiator turned back to the Elder, there was no triumphant speech. Only relief, and a mutual understanding that the galaxy had changed forever. Humanity hadn't won through strength. They hadn't outgunned or outmaneuvered anyone. They simply refused to betray their own decision, even when the consequences threatened every human life. 10,000 refugees were given permanent sanctuary. Not out of pity, but respect. And humanity earned something far rarer than safety: trust. Trust from species who had once considered humans unpredictable, emotional, and reckless. Maybe humans were all those things. But they were something else too, something the Council had underestimated. They were loyal. They were stubborn. And when the galaxy tried to break them, they stood their ground and changed the stars instead.